In the providence of God, we are members of a worldwide community known as Christadelphians. And all Christadelphians are here as a result of the life and the labours of just one man, the man whom we are to consider this evening, John Thomas. And because of this heritage, it's therefore appropriate that from time to time we should review the heritage that he has in fact bequeathed to us. We will see all through his life the hand of God shaping the circumstances to enable him to uncover the truth. In this slide we have a summary of our talk this evening. First of all, we're going to consider the Thomas family, and we will see that it was quite an extensive and in fact a very intellectual family. Then we'll focus on John Thomas's early life, and then his emigration to America. And it was during that emigration that the ship was about to sink, which made him resolve to not spare until he found the truth of the matters regarding eternal life. When he got to America, he searched and found the truth. And having done that, he spent many years contending earnestly for the faith. And in the last 10 or so years of his life, he devoted to serving and supporting the believers. So first of all, we'll start with the Thomas family. They were probably Huguenots who had come from Holland as a result of the persecution of the Protestants in that country in the 16th century. It seems that the Thomas family settled in Bristol, where in 1738 a mariner named Joseph Thomas married a Dutch lady, Sarah Moy. Moy being quite a common Dutch surname. They were married in this church, and in the record of that church you have the marriage entry. You can see the one that's highlighted: Joseph Thomas and Sarah Moy in St Nicholas Church, Bristol, April the 16th, 1738. They were a prosperous and, as we've mentioned, very intellectual family. They had 9 children, 2 of which are relevant to our story this evening. It seems that they moved from Bristol to Rotherhithe in London on inheriting John Thomas's estate there. Their first son was Moy Thomas, born in 1740, who was a lawyer. The second son, the son of Moy Thomas, born in 1787, was also a lawyer. And then in 1828, another Moy Thomas was born, William Moy Thomas. And he was quite an influential Victorian. In fact, as you see there from the screen, he was in fact the secretary to Charles Dickens for a part of his life. We actually managed to get a picture of Moy Thomas. There he is, William Moy Thomas, author, journalist, theatre critic, secretary to the owner of the Athenaeum and to Charles Dickens. A contemporary writer of his said he was a writer of rare acumen and a large knowledge of books, plays and actors. And he was in fact the second cousin of our Dr. John Thomas. But it seems that Brother Thomas was later very reticent about talking about his family. It seemed as if he didn't want to fly under their colours. Or rather sail under their colours, I should have said, shouldn't I? Then, going down almost to comparatively recent times, we have in 1952 another descendant who was also called Moy Thomas, and a contemporary of him describes him as having a first-class brain, almost a genius. So you can see that the Thomas family were a very intellectual group of people. Now, reverting to the other side of that genealogical tree, the John Thomas there, we have Brother John Thomas's grandfather. Now, the Thomases on this line were what is known as dissidents. They were opposed to the established Church of England doctrine and practice in those days. We know that they were dissidents because all the family were buried at Bunhill Fields in North London. And that was a cemetery which was reserved for those who were outside the pale of the established church. So John Thomas, his son, as we'll see, the father of our brother Thomas, was buried there, and most of the family, alongside other dissidents of the age. For example, John Bunyan was buried there, Daniel Defoe, the writer, William Blake, the one who was quite hostile to the Church of England and wrote the well-known hymn Jerusalem. So that's the background of that line of the Thomas family. Now, the John Thomas, born in 1754, had 8 children, the eldest of which was the Reverend John Thomas, as he became, and he was the father of the John Thomas who we're going to consider this evening. At age 19, we'll call him the Reverend John Thomas to distinguish him from the John Thomas who's the subject of our talk this evening. The Reverend John Thomas enrolled at the Hoxton Academy, and that apparently was the only college in England for non-conformist ministers. So you see that right at the outset, the young John Thomas was in an atmosphere of independent thought on religious matters. So it seems that God's providence started at his birth and continued, as we'll see, until he had a full grasp of the truth. And so after graduating from the Hoxton Academy, his father became a dissenting minister, and in 1804 the Reverend Thomas married Jane White. They married in St Mary's Church, Rotherhithe, which is still there today, and there's the picture of the nave and the aisle through which John Thomas and his bride would have walked up all those years ago in 1804. Now, the firstborn son of that union was the John Thomas that we're to consider this evening. That was followed by 6 others. The next born, Henry, again was quite a notable person in his day. He became the secretary of the RSPCA. And apparently, so the records tell us, that like his brother, he was very energetic in the causes in which he believed. He didn't just sit in his desk running the affairs of the association, but if there was any case of animal maltreatment, he would be out there on the spot to try and correct it. So it shows the enthusiasm and the drive that this family had. Now, to complete the family tree, John Thomas was born in 1805. He married Ellen Hunt, as we'll see, in 1834, and they had a daughter, Eusebia, who married a brother, Lasius. Now, soon after his marriage, the Reverend Thomas, John Thomas's father, settled in Hoxton Square, Hackney. This is a modern picture of Hoxton Square, but in those days it was a well-known centre for these religious dissidents. In fact, no less than 25 dissenting clergy lived in this one square in London. So imagine the atmosphere in which John Thomas was brought up. So Hoxton Square was one of the birthplaces of nonconformity in London. Another resident there was a Dr. Parkinson, who gave his name to the well-known Parkinson's disease. And it's quite possible that he assisted at the birth of the baby John. Not many houses from John Thomas's era have survived, but there are just a couple which date from that time. And you can see they're on sale now for 2.5 million. But I'm sure that when the Reverend John Thomas went there, he probably rented it anyway and didn't have to pay that amount. Incidentally, on each relevant slide I've put Brother John Thomas's age in that little circle in the top right hand corner, so I won't have to keep on mentioning his age. Now the Reverend Thomas, who lived in a house like this, probably wasn't that one very similar. Although he was very well educated, he was, to quote a contemporary, an impulsive, fickle, restless being. So after Brother Thomas was born, he fell out with the leaders of the church that he had joined, and he accepted what they call a call to go to a ministry in Scotland. It was a long way north, to Huntly, 40 miles north of Aberdeen. Here is a Huntly street as it appears today. Don't be put off by the lovely paved road and the clean pavements. It was then muddy and filthy and rutted. Actually, the parsonage where the Roberts family settled is still there today. In the Huntly Library there is a record written by a local historian of the time which tells us a lot about events of Huntly when the Thomases were there. In fact, they actually mention some of the Thomases by name. Because it soon happened that the Reverend Thomas was soon disenchanted with the locality and the congregation, and when he arranged a meeting with the elders of his church in an attempt to heal the differences, his wife, Mrs. Thomas, do you know what she did? She hid all his clothes so that he couldn't go to that meeting. It showed a streak of determination that her son had in good measure. And as a result of that little artifice, the meeting was not held, and so the Reverend John Thomas and the family went back to London. Here's the historian of Huntly's account. Mrs. Thomas never liked Huntly. The streets were unpaved and often deep in mud and manure. The houses were all small and mean, the people uncultured, their speech scarcely intelligible to her. You'd imagine someone from a fairly cultivated part of London going up to North Scotland would hardly be able to understand how they spoke, let alone anything else. So you can understand why she was itching to get home. So back they came to London, and the Reverend Thomas then set up a school in Lambeth, and that's the house which is still there to this day. The school was for the sons of dissenting ministers, and it was here that the young John Thomas was educated. He would have been taught all the normal subjects, English, history, but also Greek and Latin that were to stand him in good stead in his later work. But he wasn't taught Hebrew. So being a resourceful young man at 15, he bought himself a copy of Wilson's Hebrew Grammar and taught himself Hebrew. Not many of our 15-year-olds today would do something like that, would they? Well, John Thomas was in this school at Lambeth for a few years, and then, true to character, he fell out with his neighbours again, this time with some of the parents of his pupils. And so he resolved to return to the ministry, and he accepted another call, this time to go to Chorley in Lancashire. Now Chorley was a strong Catholic area, and you can imagine why a dissident minister would go to the hotbed of Catholicism. Now that picture there was taken from a book published by a community in New Zealand describing the life of John Thomas. And I thought it was rather a grand house, so I did a little bit of research and found in fact that the house still exists today and is nothing less than one of the stately homes of the area. It's Astley Hall in Chorley. And the interesting thing was that when I contacted the Chorley Library and got hold of their archivist, she did some research for me and found that this Astley Hall, at the time the Thomases were around, actually was owned by a dissident family, a noble family, but one sympathetic to the dissident cause. So maybe in fact they did live there temporarily. In fact, the husband of the owner, and I forget her name, Lady somebody or other, had a dissident chapel in his own house nearby. So again, it's quite possible that the Reverend Thomas did feel fairly comfortable in those surroundings. But again, it's something that his son John Thomas was very reticent to mention. He never mentioned those sort of higher acquaintances which he had. Well, true to form, the Reverend Thomas fell out with the local Catholics, resulting in a series of lectures he gave. And the lectures were on the 7 Sacraments of the Catholic Church. They thought there were 7. He alleged only 2, baptism and the breaking of bread, and I think we would probably agree with him today. And he published his results as a pamphlet. Here it is, you see, an examination of the 7 sacraments of the Church of Rome by the Reverend John Thomas. Now this obviously made him investigate the subject of baptism. He decided that baptism was complete immersion, not the church's sprinkling, and he obviously discussed it with his son with long-lasting effect. John Thomas the younger was apprenticed to a local surgeon at Chorley, and when the family moved back to London, he stayed on for a little while, but later joined them and became a medical student at St Thomas's Hospital. He was there from 1826 to 1828. Here's a picture of St Thomas's Hospital in the early 19th century. Don't be confused by the St Thomas's Hospital that exists today on the bank of the Thames at Westminster. That was the later St Thomas's Hospital. This one was pulled down in the 1800s to make room for one of the local railways to come through to go to one of the termini in London. So it was there that the young John Thomas did his studies. He qualified as a surgeon. At that time he wasn't a doctor, but they still called them, he was still a mister as it were, and he became a demonstrator in anatomy. One thing that does remain from that hospital is the operating theatre. And here's the operating theatre that probably John Thomas actually sat in and watched the dissections, and later on, when he was qualified, carried out the dissections himself for the benefit of the students sitting on those raked seats around him. After 3 years he obtained his certificate, Theatre, St Thomas's Hospital, a certificate in anatomy and surgery. Here's a close-up of it. These are to certify that Mr. John Thomas has diligently attended 3 courses, and it then lists them, in anatomy and surgery. Mr. Thomas also dissected and attended the anatomical demonstrations during 2 courses. So now was the young John Thomas back in London, fully qualified to set up a practice, which he did in Hackney. And when he was a young man, he contributed several articles or contributions to the Lancet, the famous magazine of medicine which still is published today. There was a lot of discussion in those days upon the immateriality of the mind, and Mr. Dermot had put his views forward in a previous issue, and John Thomas, in the Demonstrator of Anatomy, is now advancing his opinions. And one of the propositions was, I believe that the soul, by the soul here I mean that which shall exist after death, which is scripturally denominated a spiritual body, is substantial, i.e. an immortal creature. So you see here that he was moving away from the idea of a disembodied immortal soul, but he still believed that the soul was immortal and presumably continued on after death. It shows that he was, as he were beginning to think about the conventional beliefs and moving slightly away from them. Another thing he did while he was in Hackney was to research the history of the area and produce a history of Hackney. The trouble is that Brother Thomas was much too honest in his writing, and the record of Hackney which he produced didn't do them any favours. The result was that he was forbidden access to the parish records. But he didn't give up. He was determined even in those young days. He went round all the cemeteries and the churchyards, copied down the inscriptions from the tombstones, and from that built up another history of, or a continued history of Hackney. See, one copy still survives in the Hackney Library. It shows that he wasn't afraid to speak out about wrongs. You see, there it is, MSS, History of Hackney by John Thomas MD and someone else, and we don't know who his co-author was. The Reverend Thomas, his father, had by now joined the Baptists, and restless as always, he was seized with emigration fever. Brother Thomas agreed to go out in advance to spy out the land. And so he obtained the post of a ship's surgeon on the Marquess of Wellesley. They left London on the 1st of May 1832. They had a very, very rough voyage. When they got near the coast of North America, they were 250 miles off course. They hit sandbanks off the coast of Newfoundland, and everybody thought that the ship was going to sink and they would all drown. And so, unsure of his future, John Thomas then made a resolution. These are his words. He determined that ever I got ashore, he would never rest until he had found out the truth of the matter. That actually is the quotation from his own words given to Brother Roberts later on. Well, he arrived eventually in New York after 8 weeks. The ship limped along with all the pumps working hard to stop it sinking. He arrived there 3 days before the unexpected arrival of his father. again fickle as usual. He couldn't wait for his son to report back, but he set off himself, and he had a quick journey. He set off about 5 weeks after his son, but arrived only 3 days later. He visited with his father the Presbyterian Church in New York, but he wasn't very satisfied with their teaching. But he'd had letters of introduction from the Baptists in England to go to an organisation in Cincinnati. So there he went to a well-known person at that time named Alexander Campbell. Alexander Campbell was the founder of a movement known as the Reformation, or the Disciples of Christ. Here's the plaque at his home, which is now a heritage site. Alexander Campbell. Here lived the leading influence in America's largest indigenous religious movement, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and founder of Bethany College. We won't bother to read the rest of the inscription. Alexander Campbell had come to disbelieve in infant baptism. He'd been baptized by the local Baptist church, but later he split from them and founded his own church, which, as we say, he termed the Reformation Church. And Brother Thomas and his father stayed there for a while with Alexander Campbell, but also he stayed with another local dignitary, Major Daniel Garneau. Now he was a lawyer, and a very important one. He was the chief clerk of the Supreme Ohio Court. So an important judicial post he held, but he too was a Campbellite. And while he was visiting Major Garneau, he met with another Campbellite, Walter Scott. Now, one evening, Walter Scott and the young John Thomas were talking, and Walter Scott raised the question of baptism and asked John Thomas whether he had been baptized. He answered, well, yes, he'd been sprinkled when he was an infant. But Walter Scott said, well, that isn't baptism. He opened his scriptures and pointed out to him that scriptural baptism was complete immersion. And he said to John Thomas, don't you think you ought to be baptized? And the young man said, well, I suppose so. So they went out that night, and John Thomas was baptized in the Miami Canal, Cincinnati. As he later said, he was baptized into a sect, not into the truth. He then went back to Major Garneau's, where he probably met Major Garneau's wife's cousin, Ellen Hunt, whom he later married in 1834. The Garneaus looked after her during Brother Thomas's early travels, so he was obviously very appreciative of their administrations, and obviously had a lot to do with this clerk, Supreme Clerk to the Court of Ohio. Then he and his new wife moved to Richmond down south in Virginia. But before that, he stayed with Alexander Campbell in his house at Bethany. Well, here's a picture of John Thomas, aged 25, and his wife, Ellen Thomas. We know this is the only picture that we could find of her. She was obviously a very patient, although a quite sick woman. And one of the accolades of Dr. Thomas's wife was the doctor had one of the best wives. Well, they stayed for a while with Alexander Campbell at his house at Bethany, and here is the house still there today. Although it has been renovated, it hasn't been substantially altered. But what happened here was that one day Alexander Campbell said to the young John Thomas, "I'm going to call upon you to speak at the meeting tonight." Imagine how he felt. But he couldn't get out of it. Alexander Campbell was absolutely insistent. So the young John Thomas thought, well, he remembers Rollin's ancient history speaking about the 4 Roman empires. So he gave an address on Daniel chapter 2 and the sequence of empires, which apparently was very well received. And he was then, from then onwards, in much demand as Christian speaker. But he realised that he didn't know much about what he was talking about. So he resolved to study the scriptures for himself. And that was the unexpected effect of Alexander Campbell insisting on him giving that address. So he then settled in his own house. Here it is at Richmond, Virginia. He set up a medical practice which was very successful, but his practice suffered as a result of all his study for his preaching work. Another doctor in the town commented, "What a fool Dr. Thomas is. If he would only devote himself to his profession, he would ride in the finest carriage in Richmond." Alexander Campbell made another request to his young protege to start a publication on the Reformation, which is what they termed their movement. And so Brother Thomas started a magazine called the Apostolic Advocate, and the first issue was in May 1934. Still only 29 years old, you see, Brother Thomas at this stage. And this started him on a course which led to a breach with the Campbellites, because in only the 6th issue he published an article entitled Anabaptism. Ana is a Greek for again, so this is re-baptism, being baptized again. And in it he not only denied infant baptism, but believed that all those who had been sprinkled needed to be baptized again on coming to a knowledge of the true Christian faith. And that offended many of the Campbellites who had not been baptized. So he says, immersion is not baptism, it depends on understanding the gospel. And this antagonism with Alexander Campbell developed further as Brother Thomas gradually unearthed the truth. So soon he broke with Campbell and preached in this meeting place at Painville. He was beginning to attract some support for his views. Now at the end of 1836 he moved to a farm 26 miles away. He did this hoping that he could support his family by farming better than his declining medical practice, which was suffering, of course, only because of his biblical studies and his writing. In the 1835 Advocate, he published a series of 34 questions under the heading Information Wanted. And these are just 3 of the questions. Is man naturally immortal, or is immortality a gift from God? If at death a man be instantly translated to heaven or hell, how can he be said to be dead and to rise again? Does not the promise to Abraham refer to the personal possession of Canaan under the personal reign of the Messiah? You see how he's beginning to unearth the basic features of the truth. Well, this article in the Advocate caused great offence among the Campbellites. They regarded it as a declaration of beliefs rather than John Thomas's request for information. But again, it made him study further, and he was beginning to be supported by quite a few, which encouraged him very much. He had several public debates with Alexander Campbell on the mortality of man, the state of the dead, and the resurrection of the dead. Now in 1839 to 40, Brother Thomas again relocated. This time he went a long way away to a farm in Longgrove, Illinois. That's, if you remember your map of North America, just south of Lake Michigan, one of the 5 Great Lakes. In fact, it was near his brother-in-law at a place called Longgrove. He first went out on his own on horseback. 900 miles he travelled in 23 days. He described it as toiling day after day over mountains, through swamps and newly opened wilderness, existing upon everlasting eggs and bacon, half-baked dough and homemade coffee. So it was a rather tedious journey, but it was relieved when he got to a place called Hawk's Nest Gorge. And there, as he went up to this vantage point, which is still there today where this picture was taken from, he exclaimed at this spot, "Great and wonderful are thy works, O Lord God Almighty. Who would not fear thee and glorify thy name?" Shows that even at this young age of 29, he had immediate recourse to the words of Scripture which he'd been studying. And as Robert Roberts later said, he was a great observer and possessed an extraordinary taste for the sublime in nature. Well, he bought a farm in Yorkville, Illinois, and then returned to Virginia to his wife and now a daughter after 3 months away. And then the whole family in covered wagons spent 2 months going to take possession of this new property. He says that they camped each night in the woods, and when they arrived after 2 months' tedious journey, there was no house on the new farm, so the publication of the Apostolic Advocate was temporarily suspended while Dr. Thomas himself built one. Well, it didn't work out all that well, because after 6 months the doctor decided that the work was too isolating and left him little time for writing. So they left the farm in the hands of someone else and moved 25 miles away to a place called St. Charles. And here Brother Thomas commenced the publication of a weekly newspaper. Also, he formed medical associations with the newly founded Franklin Medical College, where he became its president and a lecturer in chemistry. And it was that college that bestowed a doctorate on him. But even so, I think he yearned back for the east coast of America. So in October 1842, he went back to the east coast. He sold the farm through an agent and renewed an acquaintance with Major Gayno and Walter Scott, and he attended Campbellite meetings again. At first, actually, they didn't recognise him, as his outdoor life and hard work on the farm had aged him considerably. But all this time he was continuing his studies of the Word and debating it. Then he decided on his own initiative, to make a publication. So he commenced the Herald of the Future Age. He was beginning now to understand the truth as we know it, slowly gaining support for the things that he preached in America and in the UK. And here's the first edition of the Herald of the Future Age, a non-sectarian periodical devoted to ancient Christianity and to the illustration of the new constitution of the Kingdom of Israel and of the world in the future dispensation. You can see how all the elements of the truth are there now, even in that heading. Well, one thing became very evident to him, that before he hadn't been truly baptized. One has to understand the true hope of Israel before baptism is efficacious. And so, in 1847, he was baptized into Christ, not into a sect as he was before. He arranged this. He said to a colleague, "I desire you to immerse me. All I ask of you is to put me under the water and pronounce the words over me. Upon confession of your faith in the things concerning the kingdom of God and the name of Jesus Christ, I baptize you into the name of the Father, Son and Holy Spirit. I don't ask you for any prayer or any ceremony. All that is necessary I will do for myself, except the mechanical part of putting me under the water and the utterance of these words." So that was a turning point in the life of Brother Thomas, because he had now reached the end of the journey. As he said, "After a journey of 14 years I had found the truth, which on the ocean I declared I would not rest till I had found, should it be permitted me again to tread on terra firma. But in all this journey I have been directed in a course very different from what I would have selected if I had been left to map it out for myself." So he acknowledged then the providence of God in all his ways. Well, he was now absolutely sure of what he believed, but he still had all these people who looked up to him to a certain extent as a preacher. He had to tell them what his new beliefs were. So he then published immediately what he styles his confession, abjuration and declaration. A confession, which is a dictionary definition, says a formal acknowledgement of past wrongs. And despite the respect for Scripture induced by what he termed a godly and pious mother, he had listened to the words of men rather than God, and was previously immersed without knowing the true hope. That was his confession. And so he abjured his previous life. And abjuration means renouncing past wrongs. He renounced much of what he had once taught: immortal soul, heaven going, baptism without knowledge, and so on. And then he made a declaration, a formal statement of what he now believed. And in it, in a very lengthy document, he set out the truth as we know it today. This was a turning point in his life. It led to the final break with Alexander Campbell. And Don Thomas then spent the rest of his life proclaiming the truth. So soon after, he went on a preaching tour, ending in New York. He gave a course of 10 lectures there, which was very successful, so much so that the congregation there offered him a paid preaching post to be their minister. But he refused. "We cannot afford to sell our independence for a mess of pottage," he said. So, in the age 42, in 1848, he made his first visit to Britain. He sailed with his daughter Eusebia on the DeWitt Clinton, this time a very comfortable 3-week voyage. And here he is at his first visit to Britain. Age 43. As Brother Thomas later said, the one thing that interested me, Robert Roberts was then about a 9-year-old, was the speaker's beard, which was a novelty in those days. But he came with letters of introduction from the Campbellites, oddly enough, but they had advanced news of what he believed, and they generally refused to have him. But another opening was there, and that was the Millerites. Now here, William Miller was a leader of that organisation, later became the Seventh-day Adventists, and William Miller had previously insisted that Christ would return in 1843. By 1848, 5 years later, many of his followers were disconsolate and ready to listen to Brother Thomas. And in Nottingham, 30 of them left to form the first ecclesia. So their first Christadelphian ecclesia in England was formed in Nottingham in 1848. He then went on to Glasgow, where he gave 10 lectures in the Old College Church, which apparently was very well attended and very well received. That church has since been pulled down. And then he went to the City Hall, which is still there today, where he gave 4 lectures to an audience of 5,000 each evening. Imagine it. They were so impressed with what he had to say that they asked for him to publish his views in a way that they could retain, especially as he was going back to America in a few months' time. He then went on to Edinburgh, to the Waterloo Place, which is still there, although today it's a travel lodge, where he gave 10 lectures, and again a request for a book followed. So he felt he had to honour his promise to do that. So he went back to London and stayed with his brother in Brodenell Place in North London. Now Brodenell Place today is a street which has been developed, and the place where Henry Thomas, his brother, the secretary of the RSPCA, lived is now a block of flats. But fortunately, just down the road in the same street are houses dating from those times. So on one very, very similar to this, Brother Thomas would have spent several months writing Elpis Israel. He says, I had no use for hat, boots. I worked while it was called day and much of the night also. For 6 weeks the world without was a mere blank, for during that period I had no use for hat, boots or shoes, oscillating as it were like a pendulum between 2 points, the couch above and the desk beneath. And in about 4 months the manuscript of Elpis Israel was completed. What an achievement that was. And there were no typewriters in those days, certainly no computers, of course. He had to write it all out by hand. He had to access all the many, many references and quotations that he made. And remember, most of his books were back in America in his study there. Presumably he got some new works from the local library. Maybe his brother went out to get them for him. And it must have been a terrific labour of love that he engaged for those 6 weeks. It might be appropriate at this time to say a word about Brother Thomas's writing style. We may find it rather difficult today, and especially the younger ones might find it difficult to follow. But it was the usual style for those days in the mid-19th century. Robert Roberts later wrote, these writings were so pungent, so vigorous, so satirical, and had such a sledgehammer force of argument and denunciation. Yes, that was the style of writing in those days. But Brother Roberts also says that was his writing, but to talk to, he was quiet, gentle, courteous, devoid of affectation or trace of self-importance. Well, Elpis Israel was sent off to the printer, and while it was being printed, John Thomas went to Scotland again, including Aberdeen, where he lectured in this chapel in one of the main streets in Aberdeen. And it was here that Mrs. Roberts took her young son Robert along, and he then made the comment that we've seen earlier about Brother Thomas's black hair and his beard, but apparently not much else went into the young Robert Roberts. But as a result of this visit to England, many supportive groups were established in Great Britain. Well, then he returned to America, to his house in Virginia. But this time he was beginning to get rather unwell. So when he was back in America, he pressed ahead. He restarted the Herald of the Kingdom and the Age to Come. He continued his preaching, and he describes the two different sort of venues that he would use. It would either be a soapbox, or, he said, Virginia State House, the state capital of Richmond, where for 3 evenings he lectured in the Hall of Delegates on the interpretation of prophecy. This was in effect the Parliament of the state of Virginia, and here was the room in which he lectured and which those delegates normally assembled. What an opportunity this was. Imagine one of us being invited to go and give a lecture in the House of Commons today. It was the equivalent of that. Then he embarked on extensive tours of Eastern America by horse or by coach, along what he called torrent-wasted gullies called roads. He even went up by boat to Halifax in Canada, 1,000 miles in all in that one journey. Then in 1852 he moved to New York, to this house, where he set up the first ecclesia in America as we would know it. Very similar to ours, breaking bread in the morning, a public lecture in the evening. There were 6 members at first, he records, but within a few years it was over 50. And he established there an ecclesial constitution, which is very similar to the ones that we have today. Where they met was in the Cooper Union Hall, in one of the rooms in this building. In fact, this is the first steel-framed building to be erected in America, and is still there to this day. Then in 1854 he went on more travels. Now railways were beginning to be developed throughout the land, and here's a famous locomotive of those days called the John Bull. It's the sort of train that Brother Thomas would have used in the 1850s. He may even have gone on this train because it wasn't retired until the 1866. Its maximum speed was 12 to 15 miles an hour, so it wasn't very speedy. So he went by a train, something like this, across to the Mississippi, where he joined a boat. He went 400 miles on what he describes as an overcrowded riverboat up to Cincinnati. And then he went on the Mississippi by boat again to Louisville. From there, in 1855 to 56, he did another 1,000-mile trip via train to Kentucky. And this train, he says, obviously puffed and blowed so much that he says it became exceedingly asthmatical. It took him 78 hours, an average speed of 12 miles an hour. But he does describe one rather interesting feature. When he got on one station platform, it was so crowded he thought, well, I'm not going to get a seat. He saw the train in the siding, so he slipped down to the siding, climbed in through an open window. Imagine it with his feet dangling out the rear. But he got in, ensconced himself in the corner seat, and when the train drove into the platform, it was firmly established in a comfortable seat. But in that tour, he did 30 hours of preaching. Then he went to Canada, to Toronto, where he preached in the St. Lawrence Hall, Toronto. Again, it's still there, and the hall in which he preached on the right-hand side there has been restored to its mid-19th century decorations and style. So you can imagine the now middle-aged John Thomas lecturing in this hall, again to an appreciative audience. Now he lectured there on Sundays, he didn't give up, because a bit like the Apostle Paul, he didn't only preach in the synagogue on the Sabbath, he preached during the week as well, and Brother Thomas did that in the Temperance Hall, Toronto, where he spoke every weekday evening. Back in New York in 1857, there was a Jew called Dr. De Lara who queried Brother Thomas on the nature of God, whether he was a unity or a trinity. He was a kindly man, this guy. He wasn't antagonistic to Brother Thomas, he just wanted to know his views. Anyway, this set Brother Thomas thinking and prompted him to expound the doctrine of God manifestation, which is one of the defining doctrines of the Christadelphian movement. And he expounded this in the booklet Phanerosis, as we see here. So here's a summary then of what he did in the 10 years from 1850 to 1860. Returned to America, 1851 preaching tour to the eastern seaboard, 1854 settled in New York, established the ecclesia there, 54 west to Mississippi, 55 1,000-mile trip to Kentucky, 56 to Toronto, 57 discussions with the Christian Jews, then preaching in the deep south, repeated visits next year to Canada and Kentucky, next year more visits to Kentucky and Virginia, and again in 1860. And he covered about 20,000 miles, delivered hundreds of addresses, and yet he still had time to edit the Herald and to write extensively, as he was working on Eureka at that time. This map shows the towns that he visited in those 10 years. Each black dot is a town. I've labelled the important ones, otherwise the map would get too cluttered if I put them all in. But Ogle, to the west of Lake Michigan there, is the place nearby where he had his farm after that 900-mile trip from Virginia. In 1861 he published the Exposition of the Apocalypse, Volume 1, Eureka. Volume 2, 5 years later in 66. The cost of printing these was $2,000, well beyond Brother Thomas's means. The way they published books in those days was to invite subscriptions, and when you had enough subscriptions paid for in advance, you then went ahead with the publishing. But this wasn't going very, very well. So at Ogle there was a Brother Kaufman. He offered to finance the production of Eureka in the hope that he would get his money back when the copies were sold. He was a great friend of Brother Thomas, and there's more to say about him later. Then in 1861 thereabouts, problems started in America. There was a civil war started, and the Herald of the Kingdom had to be suspended. Because he couldn't travel much in America because of the war, he again visited Britain. So he made his second visit to Britain. He stayed with Robert Roberts this time at Huddersfield, visited Halifax, Leeds, Edinburgh, Birmingham, Nottingham and London. Here is the John Thomas on occasion of his second visit. And Brother Roberts gave that wonderful appreciation of him. It's impossible to exaggerate the charm of Dr. Thomas's company under our own roof. He was a totally different man from what his writings prepared us to expect. Instead, he was quiet, gentle, courteous, well-mannered, modest, absolutely devoid of affectation or trace of self-importance. His calm, lofty, cordial reverence for the Scriptures was very edifying, as were his fireside answers to the various scriptural questions we had to propound. "Let me see," he would say, "where is that passage?" And would turn it up, and then proceed in his dignified and incisive way to open to us the Scriptures. Now, he visited all these countries in England, in his many more than this, but these are the main ones. There's one interesting one, that one down in Mumbles in South Wales, because he preached in the Baptist chapel in Mumbles, where the whole congregation were converted by his preaching and became Christadelphians. So this one-time Baptist chapel became a Christadelphian meeting hall, and it is still as such today, which is a great testimony, isn't it? Well, then he returned to New York after his preaching tour of England, and the problem of slavery was beginning to rear its ugly head. Here's an example of this, an advert for the slaves. You can't read it all, but the 3 following slaves, male and female slaves, to be sold. The unionists in the north of America wanted the abolition of slavery. The Confederates in the south wanted it retained. And in 1864, Brother Thomas wanted to go to the south. You see here the dividing line between the two opposing forces in the Civil War is represented by that blue dotted line. Richmond, where most of Brother Thomas's supporters were in the Confederate area. In fact, Richmond was the centre for the Confederate armies. And travelling was very, very difficult. The frontier between north and south was closed, so Brother Thomas was cut off. He tried to travel, and difficult though it was normally, it was much worse in wartime. He says, travel of this kind in an open vehicle and in the hot sun is very fatiguing, and with so many unburied dead horses and mules as they lie along the road, very sickening. But Providence again was at work. On the journey south, he was given letters of introduction from high-ups in the Confederate Army. Here's one of them. My friend Dr. Thomas of New Jersey, wishing to visit Virginia in connection with his churches, it gives me pleasure to introduce him to you as a gentleman in every respect, or again another testimonial, a gentleman in every way worthy of commendation. And with these letters of introduction, Brother Thomas was able to go across the dividing line between the two armies. On the way back, he again was providentially allowed to go. Down south was a Brother Magruder. He was a very loyal supporter of Brother Thomas for 20 years or more. He was also a prominent lawyer and actually a friend of President Lincoln. Again, Brother Thomas doesn't mention any of those high-up connections. But this Brother Magruder had a brother in the flesh who was in fact the general in charge of the Confederate line. And he gave Brother Thomas a letter of passage which stood him in good stead when he was arrested by the Southern police on his way north, and enabled him to cross the line under a flag of truce into the Union States. When he returned north, he then went back to Iowa, to Ogle, which you see arrowed there, to Brother Kaufman's farm. Again, as we say, he was a long-time supporter. He had a large farm, 800 acres. He was quite a little community there of Christadelphians. His brother, an ex-minister, was also there, and many Christadelphians. And Brother Thomas stayed in this house. What was going on at that time was that conscription was being introduced for the various armies, and Brother Thomas wanted to present a petition to the authorities to enable Christadelphians to have exemption, and he needed a definitive name. Up till then they'd been known as the Royal Association of Believers. So it was then that Brother Thomas coined the word Christadelphian. You can imagine him sitting in the windows maybe of one of those upper rooms thinking out the name. So we say there's quite a community there, because in the grounds of that Cold Spring Farm is a baptismal bath which they used in those days for baptising their converts. And Brother Kaufman actually had his own cemetery as part of his grounds, and here actually is his tomb. The cemetery at Cold Spring Farm, right in front there, is the Kaufman Memorial, where he and his family were buried. And in fact, Brother Thomas himself expected to be buried there, because he was such a great friend of Brother Kaufman. But he then went on more extensive preaching and consolidating tours. In 1867, Eureka Volume 2 was published, but he was beginning to suffer from poor health. In 1868-9, he published Eureka Volume 3, and then decided to visit Britain for the third time. He visited most of the ecclesias in his second visit. He says that he exhibited the truth in 145 discourses. Imagine this, quite an elderly man for those days, not very well, a preaching tour lasting only a few months, giving 145 addresses. What stamina he had, and what determination. One thing that particularly interests me, if you will forgive a personal association, was that he preached in Swansea in the Albert Hall, which is still there today, and amongst the audience was the great-grandfather of my dear wife, who then came into the truth as a result. Well, Brother Thomas, in his visit to England, decided to settle permanently there. He investigated the area of Birmingham, where Robert Roberts was now living. He decided on a plot for his new house, and Brother Robert Roberts, in his writings, actually locates it as Elmhurst, 21 St Bernard's Road, Solihull, Birmingham. I accessed the Alton public records, because Alton was a little village on the outskirts of Solihull in those days, and it reads that a new road was constructed in 1870, St Bernard's Road. The first house to be constructed in the road is thought to be Elmhurst, number 21. So it's actually in the official records is the house that Brother Thomas had commissioned. Of course, Brother Thomas, as we know, never saw it completed. But it's interesting that that house remained in Christadelphian hands, and probably most of us have seen that very old picture of the first fraternal gathering held, where 200 or so brethren and sisters met together. There's Brother Roberts there and many others. You can hardly distinguish them, but they're there in the grounds of a big house. Well, that's the house that Brother Thomas intended to live in when he came back to England. But he went back to the USA to settle his affairs. Sorry, I shouldn't have gone on there. What's happened here? Oh dear. Yes. He returned to settle his American affairs. He did one ecclesial tour, but he had to abandon a visit to Canada. He said, "Our weakness is extreme, our bulk reduced to mere bone and attenuated muscle." And then he died on the 5th of March 1871, whilst writing his last article, appropriately, "What is Flesh?" His daughter wrote, "His illness lasted 8 days of excruciating agony. He sank into a state of coma. At last, half an hour past midnight, he sank to rest, as quietly as a child." It was winter, so he couldn't be buried in the frozen ground, so he was commissioned Robert Roberts and Thomas Bosher to come across to carry out his funeral. That was the mention in his will. We know Brother Roberts very well. Thomas Bosher was a very respected brother in South London in those days, and his legacy for us today is that he was the writer of the hymn, "Jehovah dwells alone, no equal can he see." That was the work of Brother Thomas Bosher. Well, they went across to America and found that he'd been interred temporarily in this vault in Jersey City Cemetery. Go down through that black door, down some steps into the underground chamber, and there was the coffin of Brother Thomas, and Brother Roberts and Brother Bosher went down to witness it. They arrived on the 19th of April, and Brother Roberts describes how he asked the attendant to unscrew the lid, and he gazed on the face of his beloved Brother Thomas for the last time this side of the kingdom. Before he died, Brother Thomas had said, "Make no commotion when I die, just put me out of sight." But he had in fact left quite detailed instructions as to how the funeral would proceed, which took place in Greenwood Cemetery on the 30th of April. I'd like to record here thanks to Brother John Miller of Swansea, who some of you might still recall, who last year went out to America and visited the cemetery, and I'm indebted to him for these photographs. So here is the actual tomb of Brother Thomas, the red granite one in the middle. Brother Roberts and Brother Bosher were there. John Thomas had set out the procedure, set out the scriptural references to be read, which Brother Roberts carried out exactly, and so laid him to rest at this spot. Little did Robert Roberts know that he himself would eventually join his beloved friend in this same spot. And there's Brother Roberts' tomb on the left, and on the other side, the smaller black one, is the tomb of Sister Thomas, who died in 1881, and his daughter, Sister Lasius, who died in 1924. And so we have the close-up of the inscription on his grave. "Here lies in brief repose, waiting the return of the Lord from heaven, John Thomas, M.D., author of Elpis Israel, Eureka, Anastasis, Phanerosis and other works, in which he demonstrated the unscriptural character of popular Christianity and made manifest the long-lost faith of the apostles, and left behind him a body of people known as Christadelphians to continue the work begun." Well, certainly he was a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. Well, the message for us surely is to take heed of that very last phrase of that inscription, to continue the work begun. We can be sure that Brother Thomas was raised up by God to unearth the truth, and we should give thanks to the Almighty for his great work, and also determined to be worthy successors to this outstanding man. In that inscription, Brother Thomas mentions the return of the Lord Jesus Christ, and we can be sure that when he does come, he will hear these words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant, enter thou into the joy of thy Lord."